The water tasted like copper and salvation. I knelt beside the spring, watching my reflection ripple across the surface as the sun branded the back of my neck. Behind me, the research compound's solar panels caught the light like broken mirrors. This oasis, 3 acres of green impossibility surrounded by endless beige nothing, had become my entire universe. The cities were burning 80 miles west. I could see the smoke columns every evening, black fingers scratching at a blood-orange sky. That was 4 days ago. That was when I made the decision that would define whether I lived or died out here. My name is Marcus Webb, and I'm a geologist. Was a geologist. Verb tenses get complicated when civilization collapses. 3 months earlier, I'd been contracted by the Southwest Desert Research Initiative to study groundwater formations in one of the most isolated regions of the Mojave Expansion. The Elkhorn Oasis wasn't on most maps. The compound, built in the 1970s by optimistic scientists who thought they could terraform small desert pockets, had been abandoned for 15 years before my project brought me back. 4 prefabricated buildings, 1 working generator, solar array from the early 2000s that somehow still functioned, and the spring, always the spring. 40 gallons per hour of crystalline water bubbling up from some ancient aquifer, creating a microclimate that sustained palm trees, salt grass, and mesquite thickets in defiance of everything around it. I'd been scheduled for 6 weeks of solo fieldwork, take samples, map the aquifer, file reports. Simple. Then the radio chatter started getting weird on day 12. References to civil unrest in Phoenix, then Las Vegas. By day 14, the emergency broadcast system was looping instructions to shelter in place. Day 15 brought silence, complete, absolute silence. Across every channel, the satellite phone wouldn't connect. The internet, powered by a questionable cellular relay 40 miles south, went dead mid-download. I've been trying to load news websites, watching the progress bar freeze at 63%. That incomplete loading bar haunts me more than it should. Whatever information was coming through in those last packets of data, I never got to see it. I made the first supply run on day 16, drove the research jeep 70 miles to the nearest settlement, a highway junction called Furnace Creek that barely qualified as a town. Population maybe 200 on a good day. I found it empty. Not abandoned empty. Wrong empty. Doors hung open. Cars sat in the middle of the road with engines cold and keys still in the ignition. There was blood on the pavement outside the general store, dried to a black crust that crunched under my boots. I found the first body in the store's back office. Then I found what used to be a body out behind the fuel depot. Something had been eating it. Something that left human teeth marks. That's when I understood. Not the full picture. I'd pieced that together from radio fragments over the next weeks. But enough. Enough to know that returning to any city was suicide. Enough to load every useful item I could fit into the Jeep, and 2 cargo trailers I hot-wired from behind the garage. Enough to drive back to the Oasis like a man fleeing the end of the world, because that's exactly what I was doing. The first month was controlled panic. I took inventory of everything I'd scavenged. 400 pounds of canned food, 3 months of freeze-dried camping meals, seeds for vegetables, hand tools, medical supplies, 5-gallon water containers, spare solar panels, batteries, and a hunting rifle with 200 rounds. The compound's storage sheds yielded more treasures: old research equipment, a weather station, water testing kits, and boxes of supplies from previous expeditions. I had water, unlimited water, which put me ahead of 90% of survival scenarios. The solar panels gave me electricity, though I rationed it carefully. 4 hours per day of lights and equipment, unless clouds demanded I cut back further. But inventory couldn't solve the fundamental problem. I was alone in the desert with winter coming and no idea if help would ever arrive. The radio became my obsession. Every evening, I'd power it up and scan frequencies for 3 hours, logging anything that sounded like human voices. Most nights, nothing. Static hiss across every band. Then, 11 days after my supply run, I caught a transmission. Military channel. Broken, fragmented, almost unintelligible through the interference. Containment failed. Sacramento lost. Do not approach major population centers. Infected are. The signal dissolved into noise. I never heard that channel broadcast again. If you've ever felt the ground drop out from under your understanding of reality, you know what those words did to me. Keep watching and subscribe, because what I learned in the following months rewrote every assumption I had about survival, isolation, and what a man becomes when there's nobody left to witness his existence. The infected. That's what I started calling them, based on those fragmentary transmissions and my own observations from Furnace Creek. The working theory, assembled from radio scraps, emergency broadcasts, and my own terrified speculation, suggested some kind of rabies-like pathogen. Fast-moving, blood-borne, turned people violent and degraded cognitive function while ramping up aggression and pain tolerance. Victims maintained enough motor function to run, attack, and spread the infection through bites. Death followed within days for most, but the active infection period made them mobile weapons for anywhere from 48 to 96 hours. The exact mechanisms didn't matter to me. What mattered was that cities had fallen. What mattered was that I was surrounded by 100 miles of desert in every direction, and nothing infected could cross that distance without water. The desert was my moat, my castle wall. The compound sat at the dead center of a region so hostile to human life that even healthy, prepared people died out here regularly. Summer temperatures exceeded 120 degrees. Water sources were non-existent except for the Oasis. Navigation was nearly impossible without GPS, which had stopped working worldwide according to one crackling broadcast from someone claiming to be Canadian military. The terrain was a maze of box canyons, alkali flats, and boulder fields that shredded tires and broke axles. If infected stumbled out of the cities in my direction, the desert would kill them long before they reached me, probably. The uncertainty was a cold stone in my stomach that never dissolved. I established a routine because routine was the only defense against the screaming void of isolation. Dawn, I'd wake to the compound's eastern building heating up like an oven. My first action was always checking the spring, flow rate, temperature, clarity. The spring was life. If it failed, I had maybe 72 hours before I'd need to attempt the suicide mission of driving toward where civilization was gone. So I checked the spring like a man checking his own pulse, terrified of finding it weak or irregular. After the water inspection, I'd make breakfast, usually oatmeal prepared with solar-heated water, and whatever fruit I'd managed to coax from the small garden I was establishing. The previous researchers had left behind greenhouse frames, which I'd repaired using scavenged materials. Desert agriculture was a nightmare. The heat murdered most plants. Salt content in the soil was problematic. But I had time. Infinite, crushing time. So I built shade houses using old tarps and chicken wire. I germinated seeds in careful batches. I mixed compost from my own waste and the plant matter the Oasis produced. Tomatoes died. Squash died, but peppers survived. Beans showed promise. I wasn't going to starve, but I was going to be very tired of beans and peppers. Midday belonged to maintenance and projects. The solar panels required regular cleaning. Desert dust coated them in a efficiency-killing film within days. I discovered that the compound's water pump was failing, so I spent 2 weeks disassembling it, cleaning components and fashioning replacement gaskets from rubber floor mats. Every repair was a gamble. I had no replacements, no hardware stores to raid. If I broke something critical while trying to fix it, that was just how I died, slowly. Of thirst or exposure, or starvation, depending on what I'd broken. The afternoons were for exploration and fortification. I'd mapped the Oasis thoroughly in the first weeks, but I expanded my range carefully, always returning before dark. The compound's perimeter became a project. I dug a trench system around the buildings. Not deep, maybe 3 feet, but enough to trip up anything approaching in darkness. I installed noisemakers, tin cans on wire, wind chimes made from scavenged metal, anything that would alert me to movement. I reinforced doors and covered windows with metal sheeting, leaving only small observation slits. The compound transformed from a research station into something between a bunker and a prison. Evenings were for the radio. This was my window to the dying world. I'd scan frequencies methodically, logging anything that sounded human. The signals grew fewer as weeks passed. In the first month, I'd pick up a dozen transmissions per week. By month 2, maybe 5. By month 3, 1 or 2. And those were often repeating loops, automated systems broadcasting into the void long after their operators had died or fled. I started recognizing certain broadcasts. There was Denver Station, a automated voice reading off emergency protocols on a 40-minute loop. There was the pastor, though I skipped his frequencies immediately. I couldn't stomach the religious content, and it wouldn't help me survive anyway. There was someone in what might have been Baja California who broadcasted in Spanish every Tuesday at sunset. I don't speak Spanish beyond basic phrases, but the human voice was enough. That broadcast stopped in month 4. I still checked the frequency every Tuesday. Just silence now. Always silence. The nights were the hardest. That's when the isolation pressed down with physical weight. I'd lie in the sleeping bag on the concrete floor of the main building, listening to the wind move through the palm trees, and my mind would spiral. Were there other survivors? Was humanity extinct except for scattered holdouts like me? Had the infection burned through the population in weeks? Or was it still spreading? A slow-motion apocalypse consuming every refuge. Would I spend the rest of my life in this 3-acre bubble, growing old with no one to speak to, no one to witness my existence, no purpose beyond the biological imperative to keep breathing? I started talking to myself, not muttering, full conversations. I'd narrate my actions like I was making instructional videos for an audience that didn't exist. Now we're going to check the pump pressure. See how the gauge fluctuates? That indicates a partial blockage in the intake line. It helped. It kept my voice working. More importantly, it kept my mind structured. The human brain isn't designed for absolute isolation. It starts to fracture. I could feel the fractures forming, tiny cracks in my sense of self. The narration was a splint. It held me together. Mostly. Month 2 brought the first dust storm I couldn't predict. The weather station gave me temperature, humidity, and wind speed, but predicting desert weather systems required satellite data I no longer had. The storm came from the northwest at dusk, a wall of brown that turned the sky into a solid mass. I'd secured the loose equipment and shuttered the buildings, but the storm lasted 6 hours and was unlike anything I'd experienced. Visibility dropped to zero. The wind shook the prefab buildings hard enough that I genuinely feared they'd disintegrate. Sand infiltrated every gap, every seal, coating everything in a gritty layer that took days to clean. The solar panels lost 30% efficiency. The garden's shade houses shredded. I lost a week of growth on the pepper plants. But the storm did something else. It reminded me how small I was, how fragile my survival was. The desert could kill me anytime it wanted. The oasis wasn't safety. It was a temporary reprieve. The planet didn't care if I lived or died. The infected didn't need to reach me. Time and entropy would do their work regardless. That night, after the storm passed, I climbed onto the roof of the main building and looked west. The smoke columns were still visible, backlit by something that might have been fires or might have been the sunset. 80 miles. That's how far the nearest city was. I'd measured it precisely on my maps before the internet died. 80 miles of absolute nothing. Could an infected person cross that distance? Everything I understood about physiology said no. Dehydration would kill within 3 days without water. The heat would accelerate the process. Even assuming they started healthy, properly equipped and mentally sound, which the infected definitely weren't, the crossing would be nearly impossible. But nearly impossible wasn't impossible. That distinction kept me up at night. I decided to test my defenses. Not against infected, I had no infected to test against, but against intrusion generally. I spent 3 days setting up a perimeter system using motion sensors salvaged from the research equipment. Crude setup, infrared beams across likely approach paths, connected to alarms inside the compound. I tested it by walking the perimeter myself at different speeds and angles. The system caught me about 70% of the time. Not perfect, but better than nothing. I also established fallback positions. If something breached the compound, I'd retreat to the storage building, the most fortified structure, with emergency supplies and the rifle. I could hold that position for days if necessary. Against what? I didn't know. But planning gave me purpose. Purpose kept the fractures from spreading. The isolation did strange things to my perception of time. Days blurred together. I maintained a calendar, marking off each day with obsessive precision, but the markers felt arbitrary. What difference did it make if it was Tuesday or Saturday? There were no weekends anymore, no work days, just survival days, stretching into infinity. I started measuring time by projects instead. The time of the broken pump, the time of the garden construction, the time when I fixed the radio antenna. These epochs felt more real than dates. I wonder if you've ever experienced time like that, not as a river flowing forward, but as a stagnant pool you're drowning in. Drop a comment about your thoughts on isolation, because the human mind wasn't built for this, and what happened to me psychologically might be the most important part of this story. Month 3 was when I started seeing things, not hallucinations. At least, I don't think they were hallucinations. Movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that didn't match the objects casting them. Twice, I was certain I heard voices, distant shouts coming from beyond the oasis perimeter. I'd grab the rifle and investigate, hard hammering, only to find nothing but wind-carved rock and empty sand. Were these early signs of psychosis? Or was something actually out there, watching from beyond my detection range? The uncertainty was corrosive. It ate at my confidence. I doubled my perimeter checks. I slept in 4-hour shifts, waking to scan the darkness with binoculars. I found nothing. The nothing didn't reassure me. The food situation stabilized but didn't improve. My scavenged supplies would last another 7 months at current rationing. The garden produced enough to supplement, but not to sustain. I wasn't starving, but I was perpetually hungry. I'd lost weight, maybe 30 pounds judging by how my clothes fit. My body was adapting, becoming lean and efficient. Evolution in real time. Desert Marcus was emerging, different from the person I'd been before. That person had worried about publication deadlines and conference presentations. Desert Marcus worried about whether the beans would survive another heatwave. I attempted to expand my resource base. There were other sites marked on my geological survey maps, places that might have water or supplies. I made 2 expeditions beyond the Oasis during month 3, both carefully planned. The first was to a seasonal spring 15 miles north. I found it dry, just a cracked mud hole surrounded by the bones of coyotes and bighorn sheep. The second expedition targeted an old mining camp 22 miles east. The camp had collapsed decades ago, but I hoped to salvage metal, tools, maybe preserved food. I found wreckage, rusted equipment too degraded to be useful, and something else. Tire tracks. Fresh tire tracks, no more than a few days old based on how the wind had affected them. Someone else was out here. That discovery detonated my assumptions. I'd accepted my isolation as absolute. The idea that another human was moving through this region, maybe surviving like me, maybe hunting for resources, maybe infected and somehow still mobile, rewired everything. I spent an hour examining those tracks, measuring tread patterns, trying to determine direction and vehicle type. The tracks headed southwest, toward nothing that I knew of. No settlements, no water sources, just deeper desert. I followed them for 3 miles before losing the trail in a rock field. I returned to the Oasis in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on paranoia. If someone else was out here, they might find the Oasis. And if they found it, would they be friend or enemy? I had water and food, resources worth killing for if the world had descended into pure survival logic. I reinforced my defenses again. I moved supplies into multiple caches, hidden in the Oasis vegetation, so if the compound was raided, I wouldn't lose everything. I test-fired the rifle to ensure it still functioned. 12 shots into a sand berm, the reports echoing across the empty land like declarations of capability. I could defend this place if I had to. Probably. Maybe. The uncertainty was a splinter working deeper. Days passed without contact, then weeks. I saw no more tire tracks. The perimeter alarm stayed silent. Slowly, incrementally, I began to relax. Maybe they'd found their own refuge far from mine. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Another symptom of my deteriorating mental state. I couldn't decide which option was worse. Month 4 arrived with a temperature spike that turned the Oasis into a convection oven. Daytime highs pushed past 125 degrees. The shade houses helped, but barely. I retreated to the underground storage cellar the previous researchers had built. A concrete box buried 8 feet down where the temperature stayed almost bearable. I'd move equipment down there during the worst heat, working on maintenance and repairs by battery-powered lamplight. The cellar became my world for 16 hours a day. Surface time was limited to early morning and late evening. when the sun lost some of its killing power. The heat killed 3 of my pepper plants and damaged the solar panels. Not catastrophically, but efficiency dropped another 15%. I was now operating on about half the power I'd had initially. That meant shorter radio sessions, less lighting. The laptop I'd been using to maintain logs and notes got rationed to 30 minutes per day. I started keeping a paper journal instead, writing by hand in a notebook I'd found in the research supplies. The physical act of writing felt important somehow, more real than typing, like I was inscribing my existence into something tangible, creating a record that might outlast me if I failed to survive. The journal entries started factual, daily logs of temperature, water production, food consumption, but they evolved into something else. Philosophical ramblings, observations about isolation and humanity. I wrote about memory, how I could feel my memories of the previous world fading, becoming less vivid, like photographs left in sunlight. I wrote about purpose, what it meant to survive when there was no larger goal, no contribution to make, no legacy to leave. I wrote about fear, not the acute terror of immediate danger, but the chronic dread of slow extinction, of being the last person to turn off the lights. One entry from this period still stands out. I'd written, "If I die out here, these notebooks might be the only evidence I existed during the end. But who will read them? What does testimony mean when there's no one left to witness? I'm creating evidence for a trial that will never convene, testimony for a jury that doesn't exist. Still, I write, because not writing feels like vanishing before I'm actually dead. Dramatic? Maybe, but isolation strips away the social filters that keep us from confronting certain truths. I was confronting them daily, nightly, in the suspended time between sleep and waking when the mind speaks most honestly. The monsoon season arrived in month 5. I'd been dreading this. Desert monsoons are violent, unpredictable and capable of turning dry washes into deadly torrents within minutes. But I also desperately needed the rain. The spring provided drinking water, but I'd been using stored water for the garden and washing. Those reserves were depleting. Rain would replenish them. Rain would ease the pressure on the spring. Rain might keep me alive through the winter, when I'd need more water for heating and basic survival. The first storm came at night. I woke to thunder that sounded like the sky tearing itself apart. Lightning turned the darkness into a strobing nightmare. Then the rain hit. Not rain like I'd known before, but water dumped from buckets, a deluge that went from 0 to biblical in seconds. I scrambled outside with every container I had, setting up a collection system under the runoff from the building's roofs. In 30 minutes, I collected 60 gallons. The storm lasted 2 hours. By the end, I'd gathered over 200 gallons of fresh water, and the Oasis had transformed into a shallow lake. But the storm brought problems. The main building's roof leaked in 3 places. Leaks I'd patched with scavenged materials that couldn't withstand this volume of water. I spent the storm's second hour frantically positioning containers under the leaks, moving equipment trying to prevent water damage to critical supplies. The radio got wet. 2 of my battery packs took on water. I lost a month's worth of dried bean harvest that I'd stored poorly. The storm was simultaneously salvation and disaster. The following morning revealed more damage. The trench system around the compound had filled with water and collapsed in 2 sections. The garden's irrigation system had washed out, but the spring, the precious critical spring, was flowing stronger than ever, its output boosted by the storm's recharge of the aquifer. I stood beside it in the steaming morning heat, watching clear water bubble up from the earth, and felt something close to religious awe. Not religious. I wouldn't allow that framework, but something profound. The spring had sustained this place for thousands of years. It would sustain me for a few more months, or years, or however long I managed to survive. I used the post-storm period to repair and improve. I rebuilt the trench system with better drainage. I fixed the roof leaks properly using metal sheeting and sealant I'd been hoarding for emergencies. I dried out the radio and batteries. Miraculously, most of the equipment survived. I even managed to get the laptop working again after a careful cleaning. The storm had tested my infrastructure and exposed weaknesses. I patched those weaknesses. That's what survival was. A constant cycle of failure, adaptation, and incremental improvement. The radio came back online in the storm's aftermath, and I immediately began scanning frequencies. Something had changed. I was picking up more signals. Not many, but more than I'd heard in weeks. A handful of survivors were broadcasting. Most were automated loops, but 3 sounded like live transmissions. There was someone in the mountains, Utah maybe, or Colorado, describing a community of 40 people holding out in a ski resort. There was someone coastal, hard to pinpoint, talking about fishing and saltwater purification. And there was someone who claimed to be military, broadcasting coordinates and instructions for reaching a secure zone in the Midwest. I debated those coordinates for 3 days. The Midwest was over 1,000 miles away. I'd need to cross regions that were probably overrun with infected or completely dead. I'd need fuel, lots of it. And the Jeep was already showing where. I'd need to abandon the Oasis, the only place in the world where I felt marginally safe. The gamble was enormous. The potential payoff, human contact, community shared survival, was equally enormous. But something held me back. Maybe caution, maybe cowardice, or maybe I'd simply adapted too completely to isolation. The idea of being around people again felt alien, threatening, like I'd become a creature of solitude, unable to reintegrate even if the opportunity appeared. You're probably thinking I was insane to hesitate, that any chance at human contact was worth the risk. Leave a share if you think I should have gone, because the decision I made next would determine everything about the months that followed. I stayed. I convinced myself it was the rational choice. The broadcasts could be traps, raiders using false hope to lure in survivors with resources. The coordinates might lead to nothing. The military transmission a recording playing long after everyone was dead. The journey itself would probably kill me. These were valid concerns. But the truth, the deeper truth I only admitted in my journal, was that I'd started to prefer isolation. The idea of navigating human social dynamics again, the negotiations, the conflicts, the inevitable betrayals that come when resources are scarce, exhausted me. Out here, alone, I only had to trust myself. That was simpler, cleaner, lonelier, yes, but in ways I was learning to manage. So I stayed at the Oasis and continued my slow-motion existence. I improved the garden. I maintained my routines with monastic discipline. And I tried not to think about the fact that I was voluntarily choosing hermitage in the apocalypse. Month 6 brought cooler temperatures and a new challenge: wildlife. The Oasis had always attracted animals: birds, lizards, the occasional coyote stopping for water. But something had changed in the broader ecosystem. Animals that normally avoided the deep desert were appearing. I spotted a mule deer one morning, ribs showing through its hide. drinking desperately from the spring. A family of javelinas took up residence in the mesquite thicket. I even saw a mountain lion one evening, a huge male, watching me from a rock outcrop 200 yards from the compound. It didn't approach, but it didn't leave either. It sat there for 30 minutes, amber eyes tracking my movements, before vanishing into the dusk. The wildlife presence meant the surrounding regions were dying. These animals were refugees, driven into the deep desert by desperation. What had disrupted their normal ranges were infected, spreading into wilderness areas, displacing wildlife, or had human absence alone caused cascading ecological changes? I didn't know, but the increased animal activity made me nervous. More animals meant more noise, more movement, more false alarms from my perimeter sensors. It also meant potential threats. That mountain lion could decide I looked like food if it got hungry enough. I adjusted my behavior accordingly. No more evening walks outside the compound. The rifle stayed within arm's reach at all times. I stopped composting food waste near the buildings and moved the compost pile 200 yards downwind, hoping to avoid attracting scavengers close to my living area. I also started hunting, not for sport. I didn't have ammunition to waste, but for practical protein supplementation. The javelinas were the obvious target. They were numerous, relatively easy to approach, and their meat would diversify my diet beyond beans and peppers. I killed my first javelina on October morning, or what I calculated was October. My calendar might have drifted by a few days. Single shot to the head at 40 yards. The animal dropped instantly. I'd hunted before, back when the world was normal, so the act itself didn't trouble me. But the butchering process, done alone in the desert heat with inadequate tools, was brutal. I worked for 3 hours, converting the animal into usable meat, trying not to waste any portion. I ended up with maybe 20 pounds of edible protein, which I preserved through a combination of salting and sun-drying. The meat was tough and gamey, but it was food. It bought me another week of not depleting my canned supplies. The hunting continued sporadically. I took 2 more javelinas over the following weeks and 1 coyote that had been acting aggressive near the compound. The coyote meat was barely edible, stringy and bitter, but I forced it down anyway. Calories were calories, protein was protein. Desert Marcus didn't have the luxury of being picky. The increased self-sufficiency felt good. I was producing more of my own food, relying less on dwindling supplies. But it also marked another step away from civilization. I was becoming something else, not quite primitive. I had solar panels and a radio, but not quite modern either. Some hybrid creature adapted to a narrow ecological niche, surviving in the gap between worlds. The radio signals continued their slow decline. By month 7, I was only catching 1 or 2 broadcasts per week, and those were usually repeating loops. The ski resort community went silent in early November. I kept checking their frequency for weeks, hoping to hear something but found only static. The coastal broadcaster stopped around the same time. The military coordinates kept transmitting, an automated voice reading numbers into the void. I wondered how long the batteries would last. How many years would that recording play before the power finally died and the last human voice went silent forever? I had my own power concerns. The solar panels' efficiency had dropped to about 40% of original capacity. Desert dust, storm damage, and natural degradation were taking their toll. I could maintain current power usage through winter, but summer's heat and higher power demands would strain the system. I began planning for panel repairs and possible supplementation. There were houses in Furnace Creek, abandoned houses that might have solar installations I could salvage. But returning to Furnace Creek meant a 70-mile round trip, consuming fuel and risking exposure to whatever might be out there. The cost-benefit analysis was borderline. I put the decision off. I was good at putting decisions off by this point. Winter arrived with shocking cold. Desert nights had always been cold, but this was different. Temperatures dropped below freezing regularly. I had a small propane heater I'd scavenged from Furnace Creek, but propane was finite, and I needed to ration it carefully. I insulated the main building using every spare material I had: cardboard, foam, fabric, creating a smaller heated zone within the larger space. I slept in multiple layers, under every blanket I owned. The cold was manageable but unpleasant. It also meant the garden went dormant. No more fresh vegetables. I was back to living entirely on stored food and occasional meat. The isolation bore down with renewed intensity during the winter. Shorter days meant more darkness, more time alone with my thoughts. The fractures I'd noticed months earlier were spreading. I caught myself having conversations with people who weren't there, not just narrating to an imaginary audience, but actual dialogues with my brother, probably dead. My ex-girlfriend, definitely out of reach. Even my graduate school advisor, definitely dead. He'd been in Seattle when the outbreak hit. These conversations felt real while they were happening. I'd snap back to awareness and realize I'd been talking to shadows. Was this psychosis, or just how human minds cope with extreme isolation? I didn't know. I had no baseline, no comparison. I was an experiment with one test subject and no control group. I started leaving the compound for longer periods, taking day-long hikes into the surrounding desert. Partly for resources, I was scouting additional water sources and supply caches. Partly for my sanity, the movement and novelty kept the fractures from spreading further. I'd pack emergency supplies and the rifle, mark my route on a hand-drawn map, and spend hours wandering through boulder fields and box canyons. I saw no signs of infected, no signs of other survivors, no signs of anything except geology and wildlife. The desert was reclaiming its territories. Humanity's retreat was nearly complete out here. On one of these hikes, about 3 months into winter, I found something that stopped me cold. A crash site. Small aircraft, single-engined, pancaked into the side of a mesa about 8 miles from the Oasis. The wreckage was relatively fresh, no more than a few months old based on the oxidation patterns. I approached carefully, rifle ready, expecting infected or survivors or danger. Instead, I found one body in the pilot's seat, long dead and mummified by the desert heat. No signs of infection. No signs of violence beyond the crash impact itself. Just someone who'd been flying and hadn't made it. I searched the wreckage methodically, found a flight log that told me the pilot had been trying to reach a rumored safe zone in Mexico. Found maps marked with notes about fuel stops in dangerous areas. Found personal effects, photos of family, a wedding ring, letters never sent. The pilot's name was Davis, Garrett Davis, age 42, from Sacramento. He'd survived the initial outbreak and managed to acquire a plane. He'd almost made it out of the region. Then mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion or simple bad luck had put him into the mesa at what looked like 100 miles per hour. I buried Davis. Took me 4 hours to move enough rocks to cover the body properly. I didn't pray, couldn't bring myself to engage with that framework. But I stood there for a while, thinking about trajectories and chance. Davis had taken action. He'd fled, fought, adapted, tried to reach safety. It hadn't mattered. The desert had killed him just as surely as it would kill me eventually. My survival for 8 months wasn't skill or virtue. It was luck. Geographic luck. The luck of being in the right isolation when everything collapsed. I salvaged what I could from the wreck. The maps were useful. I found a multi-tool, some canned food, and a water filter. But the real treasure was a radio, better than mine, with longer range and better reception. The crash had destroyed it, but I managed to salvage components that might repair my own radio or extend its functional life. I packed everything carefully and made the long hike back to the Oasis. Arriving after dark, exhausted but marginally more equipped than when I'd left. The upgraded radio made a difference. I was able to pick up more distant signals, including international broadcasts. There was something from what might have been Australia, though the signal was so broken I couldn't be sure. There was definitely something from what sounded like a ship at sea, someone broadcasting nautical coordinates and references to island chains and clean zones. These distant voices reminded me that the world was bigger than my little bubble. Somewhere people were still fighting, still trying, still broadcasting hope or information, or just their existence into the void. But hearing those voices also made me feel more isolated. I was so far from any of those broadcasts, so fundamentally alone. Even if I wanted to reach them, the distance was insurmountable. I'd become an island within an island, isolated by geography and circumstance in ways that felt almost absolute. The psychological weight of that realization sent me into a dark spiral for about 2 weeks. I stopped maintaining the garden, let equipment repairs slide, slept 12 hours a day because being awake meant confronting the emptiness. The routines that had sustained me stopped feeling meaningful. Why maintain solar panels when there was no one to see the lights? Why grow food when I was just delaying inevitable starvation, or accident, or simple entropy? Why survive when survival itself was the only goal, a circular logic that led nowhere? The thing that pulled me out of the spiral wasn't hope or determination or any noble quality. It was anger, pure, irrational fury at the situation, at the infected, at whatever cosmic joke had put me in this position. I woke up one morning in week 2 of my depression, looked at the filthy state of the compound, and felt rage ignite in my chest like I'd swallowed gasoline and struck a match. I wasn't going to let this place fall apart. I wasn't going to validate the apocalypse by giving up. If the world wanted me dead, it would have to work harder than this. I spent 3 days cleaning and repairing everything I'd neglected. I fixed the irrigation system. I reorganized the food stores. I performed maintenance on every piece of equipment, whether it needed it or not. The work was cathartic. Physical exhaustion replaced mental anguish. By the end of day 3, the compound looked better than it had in months, and I felt something approximating purpose again. Not happiness. That seemed like a concept from another life, but purpose. The determination to continue existing, if only out of spite. Month 8 arrived with the first signs of spring. Temperatures moderated. The desert began its brief flowering period, transforming from monochrome wasteland into something almost beautiful. I'd never paid much attention to desert wildflowers before the outbreak. They'd been background details, mildly pretty but irrelevant to my geological work. Now they felt like messages, proof that life persisted, proof that cycles continued even when human civilization had collapsed. The flowers would bloom, seed, and die. Next year they'd bloom again, regardless of whether I was alive to see them. I expanded the garden aggressively during this period. The winter dormancy had taught me that I needed year-round food production, which meant diversifying crops and planting schedules. I germinated seeds in careful succession, trying to ensure I'd have something harvesting every few weeks. I also experimented with different growing locations around the oasis, testing which microclimates produced the best results. The work consumed my days and gave me something to optimize, problems to solve, that had clear solutions. The peppers did well in the eastern section. The beans preferred the northern edge where they got afternoon shade. I was learning the oasis like a language, understanding its grammar and vocabulary. The spring also brought renewed wildlife activity. The javelinas had multiplied. I counted at least 15 individuals now using the oasis. The mule deer had become a permanent resident. Birds I couldn't identify appeared in numbers I'd never seen before. The oasis was becoming a genuine refuge for the regional ecosystem. That pleased me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. If I couldn't save humanity, at least I was maintaining a pocket of biodiversity. A seed bank of sorts, though I had no illusions about how fragile it was. The mountain lion returned in late March. I spotted it 3 times over 2 weeks, always at dusk, always watching from elevated positions. It was getting bolder. The third sighting was from less than 100 yards, close enough that I could see the muscles shifting under its tawny coat. I fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing across the empty desert. The lion didn't flee. It just watched me for another 5 minutes before casually walking away, tail twitching. The message was clear. It wasn't afraid of me. It was tolerating my presence in its territory, not the other way around. I adjusted my defensive posture again. No more time outside the compound after sunset. I reinforced the doors and added metal screening to the windows. Not enough to stop a determined mountain lion, but enough to slow it down and make noise. I also started keeping a fire burning at night when I could spare the fuel. Animals generally avoided fire. The flames gave me something to focus on during the long darkness, a hypnotic dance that quieted my fracturing thoughts. But the lion wasn't my biggest concern. In early April, I picked up a radio transmission that changed everything. It was broken, fragmented, barely audible through the static. But the content was unmistakable. Someone was broadcasting from Furnace Creek, the town I'd raided for supplies 8 months earlier. The town I'd found empty and bloody and dead. The transmission was short. Supplies at Furnace Creek, 3 of us, need medical, if anyone can. Then static swallowed it. I tried to respond on every frequency I had. Called out my location, offered to help, begged for confirmation that I'd actually heard what I thought I'd heard. Nothing. The transmission didn't repeat. I scanned for hours, hoping to catch another fragment. Silence. 3 people, alive, 70 miles away. The numbers churned through my head like calculations I couldn't solve. 3 survivors meant community, shared labor, human contact. It also meant risk. I didn't know these people. Didn't know if they were genuinely in need or if this was some kind of trap. Didn't know if they were infected or infected adjacent or just desperate enough to be dangerous. The prudent choice was to stay at the oasis. The human choice was to investigate. I spent 2 days preparing. I loaded the jeep with supplies, medical equipment, food, water, ammunition. I created a cache at the oasis with enough resources to restart if I didn't return. I wrote a final journal entry explaining my decision, knowing it would never be read, but needing to create the record anyway. Then, on a clear April morning, I drove away from the only place that had felt safe in 8 months. The drive to Furnace Creek took 4 hours. The roads had degraded significantly, sand drifts covering sections, storm damage creating washouts, debris scattered everywhere. I navigated carefully, constantly scanning for threats. The rifle sat on the passenger seat, loaded, safety off. Every shadow looked like potential danger. Every rock formation could hide infected or hostile survivors. The paranoia that had become background noise at the Oasis amplified into a screaming alert system. I approached Furnace Creek from the east, stopping a mile out to glass the area with binoculars. The town looked exactly as I'd left it. Empty, damaged, dead. No movement, no smoke from fires, no signs of habitation. Had I imagined the transmission? Was this a psychological break manifesting as false hope? I sat in the Jeep for 20 minutes debating whether to proceed or retreat. The sun climbed higher. The temperature rose. Finally, I drove forward because sitting still was somehow more terrifying than moving into potential danger. I entered the town slowly, engine rumbling in the silence. The general store where I'd found the first body sat unchanged. The fuel depot looked abandoned. I drove past the residential section, past the collapsed garage, past the movement. Quick flash to my left, disappearing behind a building. Human-shaped. Definitely human-shaped. I stopped the Jeep and killed the engine, grabbed the rifle, stepped out into the street with my heart trying to punch through my rib cage, called out, "I'm here to help. I heard your transmission. I have medical supplies." Silence. Then, cautiously, a voice, "Show yourself. Hands where we can see them." Male voice, young, maybe early 20s, frightened, but trying to sound authoritative. I stepped into the open, rifle pointed at the ground, hands visible, called back, "I'm alone. Just want to talk." Two men, one younger, a teenager maybe, one older, probably late 50s. They looked like survivors, gaunt, filthy, armed with improvised weapons. The older man held what looked like a machete. The younger one had a baseball bat. The teenager, because that's definitely what he was, maybe 16, held a tire iron. We stared at each other across 50 feet of empty street. 8 months of isolation had atrophied my social skills. I didn't know what to say, how to initiate, what protocols existed for meeting strangers in the apocalypse. So I went with basics. "My name is Marcus Webb. I've been surviving at a research station. Heard your transmission. Are you injured?" The older man spoke. "You got food? Medicine?" "We've been living on scraps for weeks." Not an answer to my question, but information nonetheless. They were desperate. Hunger and possibly sickness had driven them to broadcast. That made them potentially unpredictable, but probably not immediately hostile. Starving people want resources more than violence. I made a decision that could have gotten me killed. I have supplies in the Jeep, medical kit, food, water. I can share, but I need to know what happened here. Last time I came through, this place was empty. The three of them exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them. Then the older man lowered his machete slightly. "We've been hiding. There were infected here, probably still are, deeper in the buildings. We holed up in a basement waiting them out. Been down there for months. Thought we were the last people alive until we found that radio transmitter last week." The pieces assembled in my head. These three had survived by hiding, by going underground literally and figuratively. They'd outlasted the infected through patience and isolation, much like I had. But their resources had run dry. They'd been forced to broadcast, a desperate gamble that I'd happened to hear. I walked slowly back to the jeep, keeping movements visible and non-threatening. Retrieved a box of supplies, canned food, water bottles, first aid kit, carried it to the middle of the street and set it down, stepped back, called out, "Take it. There's more if you need it, but I need information. What happened in the cities? Is anyone organizing? Are there safe zones?" The teenager rushed forward and grabbed the box like he expected it to disappear. The younger man followed, helping carry it back. The older man stayed in position, watching me with calculating eyes. When the supplies were secured, he spoke again. "Dead or evacuated. We don't know which. We caught some radio chatter early on. Military saying they were establishing quarantine zones. Then nothing. That was 7 months back. We haven't heard organized broadcasts since." 7 months. That matched my timeline. Whatever coordinated response had existed, it had collapsed quickly. The older man continued. "Infected are still around, but they're different now. Slower. Some of them are dying off. We've found bodies, genuine corpses, not just dormant infected. But there are still active ones. We see them sometimes, wandering through. They don't seem to have any direction anymore. Just wandering." That was new information. The infection was burning out, or evolving, or something. If infected were dying off naturally, it suggested the pathogen had a limited lifespan, or the hosts were succumbing to environmental factors. That could mean the world was slowly becoming safer, or it could mean the infected were adapting into something worse. No way to know without more data. Have you ever had to decide whether to trust strangers when your life depends on that choice? Drop a comment about trust in survival situations, because what I decided in those next minutes would reshape the entire trajectory of my isolation. I made the offer before I'd fully thought it through. I've got a secure location, water, food production, power. It's isolated, middle of nowhere. If you want to come with me, I can take you there. But you need to understand, it's my place, my rules, and if anyone becomes a threat, they're out. Permanently. The older man finally nodded. "We'll come, but we need to collect some things first. Personal items. Give us an hour." I agreed, though every instinct screamed that this was a trap. I watched them disappear into one of the buildings, then returned to the jeep to wait. The rifle stayed in my hands. My position gave me sightlines to all approaches. If this went wrong, I'd at least see it coming. They returned in 40 minutes, carrying backpacks and a few salvaged items. No weapons beyond what they'd already shown. They looked genuinely desperate, genuinely grateful. The older man introduced himself as Robert Chen. The younger man was his son, David. The teenager was Kyle, a neighbor's kid Robert had found hiding 3 weeks into the outbreak. They'd been surviving together ever since, a makeshift family forged in catastrophe. The drive back to the Oasis was tense. I led in the jeep, the 3 of them following in a battered pickup truck they'd been hiding in a garage. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting them to pull weapons or veer off to ambush me from another angle. But they just followed, maintaining distance, causing no problems. We reached the Oasis as the sun hit the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and blood. They stared at the spring with expressions I recognized, disbelief transitioning to hope. Robert actually laughed, a sound so unexpected it startled me. "Water," he said. "Actual flowing water. I thought places like this were myths. I showed them around the compound, established basic rules, assigned sleeping spaces in the secondary building. They'd have shelter, water, and food. In exchange, they'd contribute labor to maintenance, food production, and defense. The dynamic was awkward. I'd spent 8 months alone, and suddenly there were other humans occupying my space, touching my equipment, existing in my sanctuary. But there was also relief. The crushing isolation lifted slightly. I wasn't the last person anymore. There were 4 of us, a tiny community, a fragment of civilization preserved in the desert. The first few days were an adjustment period. Robert turned out to be a former electrician, which was invaluable for maintaining the solar system. David had agricultural experience from working on his grandfather's farm. Kyle was young, but eager to help with whatever needed doing. They brought skills I lacked and energy I'd depleted. The compound's productivity increased immediately. We expanded the garden. We repaired systems I'd been putting off. We established watch rotations so someone was always monitoring the perimeter. But proximity also brought friction. Robert questioned some of my resource allocation decisions. David wanted to modify systems in ways I thought risky. Kyle played music on a battery-powered speaker he'd brought, which drove me insane after months of silence. Small conflicts emerged. Who used how much water, whose turn it was for certain tasks, how to handle the limited privacy. I'd been monarch of my tiny kingdom for 8 months. Suddenly I had to negotiate, compromise, consider other perspectives. It was exhausting. The social reintegration was harder than I'd anticipated. I'd forgotten how to read social cues, how to modulate my voice for conversation rather than narration, how to share space with other humans. I caught myself snapping at Kyle for minor infractions. I retreated to my sleeping area for hours, overwhelmed by the constant presence of others. Robert noticed and pulled me aside one evening. "You've been alone too long. We get it. Take the time you need. But don't shut us out completely. We're all trying to figure this out together." His words helped. I consciously worked on reintegration, forcing myself to participate in group meals, to contribute to conversations beyond tactical planning, to remember what it felt like to be human in a social sense, rather than just a biological sense. It came back slowly, like learning a language I'd once been fluent in. The fractures in my mind began to heal, the isolation-induced damage repairing itself through human contact. But not everything healed. I still had nightmares about being alone again. I still caught myself narrating actions to an imaginary audience. I still felt most comfortable during my watch shifts, when I could sit in silence and scan the dark desert without needing to perform social functions. Desert Marcus hadn't fully transitioned back to regular Marcus. Maybe he never would. The group's presence also brought practical benefits. With 4 people, we could undertake larger projects. We built a proper workshop in one of the unused buildings, consolidating tools and creating a dedicated repair space. We constructed a better water collection system, maximizing monsoon season harvesting. We expanded the perimeter defenses, adding more trenches and warning systems. The compound was becoming genuinely fortified, a small fortress in the desert. We also started regular supply runs. With 2 vehicles and multiple people, we could raid locations that had been too risky for me alone. We hit 3 abandoned settlements over the following weeks, collecting everything useful: tools, building materials, clothing, food, medicine, books. The books were David's idea. Something to maintain mental stimulation during downtime. We assembled a library of sorts, survival guides, agricultural manuals, technical references, and even fiction. I read more in those weeks than I had in the previous 8 months. The stories reminded me that human experience encompassed more than just survival, that there had been, and might again be, space for art, imagination meaning beyond immediate necessity. The radio became a group activity. Every evening we'd gather and scan frequencies together, logging anything we heard. The signals remained sparse, but we were picking up more variety now. There was definitely an active community somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. We caught regular transmissions describing agricultural efforts and population numbers. There was someone in Texas broadcasting weather reports which seemed bizarrely normal. And the military coordinates kept repeating, though we'd collectively decided that chasing those was too risky without more information. Robert suggested we start broadcasting ourselves. The idea made me uncomfortable. Broadcasting meant announcing our location, inviting potential threats. But the counter-argument was compelling. If there were other survivors, they deserved to know about the Oasis. We could be a waypoint, a resource, a beacon for people who needed hope. After extensive debate, we agreed to limited broadcasts. Once per week, Robert would transmit basic information. Survivor community water available. Coordinates obscured enough to require genuine navigation skills to find us. If people could reach the Oasis, they probably deserved the refuge. The first broadcast went out in mid-May. We received no responses. The second broadcast a week later, nothing. The third broadcast, we got static that might have been someone trying to respond, but we couldn't be sure. The fourth broadcast brought results. A voice, clear and desperate. "This is Amanda Rodriguez. I'm with 2 others. We're 70 miles northeast of your location. Can you provide more specific coordinates? We have children." Children. The word hit like a physical impact. There were children alive. The future wasn't completely extinct. Robert looked at me, waiting for the decision. This was still my compound, technically my call. I thought about the mountain lion, about limited resources, about the risks of expanding our group. Then I thought about the alternative, leaving children to die in the desert because I was afraid of change. I grabbed the radio transmitter. "This is Marcus Webb at the Elkhorn Oasis, transmitting precise coordinates now. Be advised, travel during early morning or evening only. Bring all the water you can carry. We'll send a vehicle to meet you at Waypoint Delta if you can reach it." We spent the next 2 days preparing, cleaned the compound, organized supplies, set up additional sleeping areas, discussed contingency plans if the newcomers turned out to be hostile. The tension was palpable. We were either expanding our community or inviting disaster. No way to know which until they arrived. They appeared on the 3rd day. Amanda Rodriguez, her brother Javier, and 2 children. Amanda's daughter Sophie, age 9, and Javier's son Miguel, age 6. They arrived in an ATV that was more rust than vehicle, pulling a small trailer loaded with supplies. They looked like refugees from history textbooks, dusty, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. The children's eyes were too old for their faces, that specific hollowness that comes from witnessing things no child should see. We brought them in, got them water and food, set them up in the secondary building. Amanda cried when she saw the spring. Just stood there with tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face, watching water flow from the earth like it was the most beautiful thing in the universe. Maybe it was. The children were another adjustment. Their presence changed the compound's entire character. We had to child-proof dangerous areas. had to moderate our language and topics of conversation, had to create routines and structures that gave them stability and something approximating normalcy. Sophie was old enough to help with simple tasks. Miguel was still young enough to sometimes forget the world had ended, playing with rocks and lizards like children had always done. Watching them play did something to my psychology. It reminded me that survival wasn't the end game, it was maintenance. The actual point was whatever came after survival: growth, learning, continuation. These children represented that continuation. If we could keep them alive, teach them skills, give them knowledge, maybe humanity had a trajectory beyond just lingering extinction. Amanda and Javier integrated well. Amanda had medical training. She'd been a paramedic before the outbreak, which made her immediately invaluable. She assessed our medical supplies, organized them properly, and even treated some minor ailments we'd been ignoring. Javier was a mechanic. He got the Jeep running better than it had in months and started working on long-term maintenance for both vehicles. Our community of 4 had become 7, and the compound felt genuinely alive. But more people meant more complexity. Resource consumption increased. Water usage went up significantly. With the children, food production needed to expand. We were still secure, still sustainable, but the margins were tighter. We implemented stricter rationing and expanded the garden again. Every available space became cultivation area. We were approaching the limits of what the Oasis could support. That realization led to difficult conversations about whether to accept more survivors if they appeared. Robert argued we had a moral obligation to help anyone we could. Amanda agreed. David was uncertain. I was hesitant. Every additional person reduced our security margin. Javier pointed out that more people also meant more labor, more skills, more defensive capability. There was no clear answer. We decided to evaluate on a case-by-case basis, knowing that decision-making by committee was messy but probably more ethical than my previous autocracy. The summer heat returned with intensity. We were better prepared this time. More water storage, improved shade structures, better heat management. But we were also supporting 7 people through the worst temperatures, which strained everything. We rotated through the underground cellar, spent midday hours doing minimal activity, adjusted our schedules to match the environment rather than fighting it. The children struggled with the heat initially, but adapted with the resilience that kids somehow possess. During this period, I realized something that should have been obvious earlier. I wasn't depressed anymore. The isolation-induced darkness had lifted. I was engaged with life again, participating in a community, contributing to something beyond my own survival. The fractures had healed, though I could still feel the scar tissue. I'd been damaged by the isolation, changed by it, but not permanently broken. Given the right circumstances, human contact, purpose, connection, I'd recovered. That felt significant somehow, though I wasn't sure why. The radio brought news in late June. The Pacific Northwest community was broadcasting regularly now, describing themselves as New Cascadia, a coalition of survivor groups totaling over 300 people. They were farming, building, establishing governance structures. They were trying to restart civilization. The broadcasts included invitations for survivors to join them, with detailed routes and waypoints. It was the first genuinely organized society I'd heard evidence of since the outbreak. We discussed it extensively. Should we try to reach them? Stay at the Oasis? Split up? The debate consumed several evenings. Robert wanted to go. He saw New Cascadia as the future, a chance to be part of something larger. Amanda was torn. She wanted community for the children, but feared the journey. David, Kyle, and Javier voted to stay. I abstained. After 8 months of isolation followed by hard-won community building, I wasn't sure what I wanted. The decision resolved itself when Robert announced he'd be leaving regardless. He wasn't demanding anyone join him, but he'd made his choice. David decided to go with his father. We spent a week preparing their departure, stocking their vehicle, mapping routes, sharing everything we knew about regional conditions. The morning they left was emotional. We'd become family in some awkward apocalypse-forged way. Watching them drive into the desert felt like losing parts of myself. Our community was now 5. Me, Kyle, Amanda, Javier, and the 2 children. Smaller, but perhaps more sustainable. We adjusted our operations, contracted some of the more ambitious projects, focused on stability rather than growth. The compound settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. We worked, ate, slept, and occasionally allowed ourselves moments of something like happiness. Sophie laughed one evening while playing with Kyle. Miguel asked me to teach him about rocks, apparently thinking being a geologist was the coolest thing imaginable. These moments were small but profound, fragments of regular life persisting in irregular circumstances. The infected question remained unresolved. We'd seen no direct evidence of them in the immediate region, but the radio occasionally brought reports of sightings elsewhere. The pathogen seemed to be burning out in some areas while persisting in others. No clear pattern emerged. We maintained our defenses and remained vigilant, but the acute terror of the early months had faded into chronic wariness. Month 8 ended not with dramatic revelation, but with quiet persistence. We were survivors in the literal sense. We'd survived, but we were also something more. A community, a family unit, a seed of potential future. The Oasis sustained us. The world beyond remained mysterious and possibly hostile, but we'd carved out a space that was ours. I stood by the spring one evening, watching water bubble from the earth like it had for millennia, and would for millennia more. The smoke columns on the western horizon had disappeared weeks ago. Either the fires had burned out, or I'd simply stopped noticing them. The sky was clear. The stars were emerging. Somewhere in the compound, Amanda was singing to Miguel. Javier and Kyle were working on the evening meal. Sophie was writing in a journal I'd given her, documenting her experience for some hypothetical future reader. We were alive, against considerable odds, despite systemic collapse. Through isolation and desperation and adaptation, we were still alive. That wasn't everything, but it was something. It was enough. If this story connected with you on any level, if you felt the isolation, understood the choices, recognized the transformation that extreme circumstances force on us, then share it with someone else, because survival stories aren't just about the mechanics of staying alive. They're about what we become when everything familiar disappears, and whether humanity persists when civilization doesn't. This has been my account of 8 months at the edge of the world. Thank you for witnessing it. Maybe somewhere, someone else is fighting the same fight. Maybe they need to know they're not alone. Maybe that's all any of us really need. Evidence that we're not the last voice calling into the darkness, hoping for an answer that might never come.